So Corey Hinderstein is a vice president at the Nuclear Threat Initiative, which is a major NGO working on issues of nuclear danger. She was very much involved until recently, she was working at the National Nuclear Security Administration, where she was very much involved in the Nuclear Security Summit process and also in implementation of the Iran deal. Before that, she was at the Nuclear Threat Initiative before and was very much involved in a variety of nuclear security issues, including, I would give Corey, I would say, 60 or 70% of the credit for the creation of a really important organization called the World Institute for Nuclear Security. Also, Corey was the first person, I think, outside the government to figure out exactly where Natanz was and that it was an enrichment plant.
Yeah, my family, like to say, I started the Iran nuclear crisis. Thank you very much. Well, thank you to Matt, and a great predicate. Thank goodness when we talked in advance, then we went off separately to do our materials, and having come back together, I don't think we repeated very much. So that's good, and I think we've also left a lot of stuff for discussion. So I want to start by saying one thing, which is that nuclear security in general is, in the United States, a bipartisan, or even better, a nonpartisan issue. To kind of paraphrase one of my favorite books, it is a truth universally acknowledged that nobody wants a terrorist to get a nuclear weapon. So we might differ, different administrations, and sometimes not even on party lines, might differ about what's the best approach, how do we allocate the funding, but in general, this is an issue that a lot of people agree we need to be dealing with, and we need to be dealing with consciously, actively, and in an evolving way. So I do want to make one point, which is kind of, what are we talking about when we say security versus safety versus safeguards? And you can replace the word safeguards with non-proliferation if you like, it just ruins the alliteration. So what we're really talking about here is, what is the risk, who is the actor, and what are we trying to do to control the situation? So security, as we're talking about in this session, is the risk of a non-state actor or an unauthorized person gaining access to material that they could use to have a nuclear or radiological effect on either other people, the environment, etc. That could be a big mushroom cloud, it could be a sabotage, it could be the dispersal of radioactive material, which need not actually even be a dirty bomb. My favorite speculation on what a real, following on some of the polonium experiences, what would be the effect of somebody just taking radioactive cesium, for example, and as they walk through the metro in DC, sprinkling it out of the bottom of their pocket, like in Shawshank Redemption. That could be extremely disruptive. It's not a bomb. So who's the actor? Non-state actor or a state actor? Non-proliferation is, in general, about a country acquiring nuclear weapons, whereas security is about a person or a group acquiring nuclear weapons. And what can we control about the situation? This is where I really bring safety into it. Safety is about accidents. It's about kind of the odds of anything happening are generally, as we heard from Alex, non-zero. So the odds of something, a mishap in a nuclear power plant, a mishap with a nuclear weapon, a mishap with nuclear material in a hospital, all of that is not something that somebody has deliberately set about to do, but something that has happened because things happen. So we're focusing here on deliberate acts by non-state actors, and that's kind of the general scope of security. So going back in time, we had old-fashioned views about security. I'm going back so that I can go forward. It used to be focused at the site, and sometimes at the national level, but a lot of times in isolation. So just like in a bank, you had, every bank decided where it would put bulletproof glass, if at all, in front of the tellers, where's the safe, who's got the combination of the lock. It was kind of up to the sites individually, and in some cases, the countries had some overall guidance. But this was all done in isolation, and it continues, kind of jumping forward. It still is kind of a truism in security that security is the domain of the state, and it is the domain of every individual state. Security, for a long time, and I would argue still to a great extent, takes a back seat to safety by operators and regulators. If you're operating or regulating a facility that has this kind of material, you're used to dealing with safety. You know what your requirements are. You know what the safety basis is. In other words, how many times out of 1,000 will it, is something likely to happen, and what are all the steps that happen. Safety and security are actually complementary in some cases, but they're in conflict in others, and Matt threw one out and then moved right past it. When he talked about this, a cesium source in a hospital, safety will tell you that because you don't want people walking into that room, especially when the source might be in use, you don't want somebody walking in and accidentally exposing themselves, and now that's a major safety issue. So what do? You put a giant sign on the door. But if you're, from a security point of view, saying, I don't want to put a blinking arrow directly at the most sensitive thing in my hospital, I would rather have that be a blank door in an unobtrusive area of the hospital. Well, those two things don't always work together. Similarly, if you have a sensitive area, you might want to have lots of doors for safety, because what if something happens? Something's going on over here. You need your workers to get out fast and to have clear paths. Okay, well, that's great, but for security, now you have 5, 6, 7 access points to control instead of 1. So security folks would say, we want 1 access. So those are places where they can kind of be in conflict. It used to be that security had little attention of senior management, boards of directors, policymakers, etc., because again, it was up to every individual site, and in some cases at the country level. I'll focus, skip a few of these, but borders were focused on the customs and taxation. If this was something that you were or were not supposed to bring into the country because it needed to be taxed or tariffed, that was much more interesting than whether you're bringing in something dangerous. And also the sense that security undermines productivity of sites. And a lot of sites are commercial entities. And every dollar they spend on security is a dollar off the bottom line, whereas on safety, they're used to saying, okay, we have to accept a certain cost for safety. So what happened? We also had conventional wisdom about nuclear terrorism. So put all that, how we think about safety, and then add to that a conventional wisdom about nuclear terrorism. Mass casualties are against the aims of terrorist groups, against the political goals of terrorist groups. You need people to support you, not turn off the world. A terrorist group could never build a nuclear weapon. The material self-protecting. You'd have to be you'd have to be suicidal to try to handle this material. Well, we all know what changed. The 9/11 attack was not a nuclear attack, but it fundamentally changed how the perception of nuclear terrorism was approached at both private and public, governmental levels. So one of the things that changed is that President Obama decided to launch this series of nuclear security summits. Well, he originally announced one. It turned into a series. And the nuclear security summits were really one of the first times that many countries around the world gathered together at the most senior level, president, prime minister, king, queen level, to say, what is it that we need to do together to reduce these risks? Because these risks are not anything that any one country can manage alone, and the consequences of any of us failing would be so catastrophic. What I think is important as I go through, and I'll come back at the end to some of the accomplishments of the whole nuclear security enterprise, is a lot of the things that were captured under the Nuclear Security Summit process were activities that were actually already going on. They might have been going on at a national level in some cases. Maybe there was a bilateral agreement or bilateral cooperation. But what this did is it kind of galvanized everything into a bigger picture and said, this is something we all have to care about. So I'm not going to go through each one of these. It started in 2010 in Washington, the second 2 years later in Seoul, 2014 in The Hague, and then 2016 in DC again. And this was designated to be the last summit. And a lot of people put that, again, I wanted to start by saying this is not a partisan issue. A lot of people put that because this was an Obama thing. And to a certain extent, yes, but to another extent, you can't sustain summits forever. It's untenable. You lose momentum, you lose a mission, you lose attention. But also because a lot of accomplishments had been made, and actually by 2016 it was harder and harder to find those big headline things that you could say this was a great outcome of this summit. But so what 16 did, in addition to the individual accomplishments, which I'll come back to kind of the whole list, what 2016 did was focus on the sustainability. The recognition that nuclear security, as long as there is nuclear and radiological material anywhere in the world, this has to be a mission high on the agenda of the international community. We could argue or talk in the Q&A about how successful that has been in the 2 years since the last summit, how successful it will be in the future. So it was about sustainability. It was about continuing regular interaction, even if it wasn't at the presidential level. And it was about empowering international organizations who actually can carry the mission forward. So what are some of the tangible outcomes? Almost 50 countries plus Taiwan have cooperated in particular with the Department of Energy and NNSA to remove weapons usable in nuclear material. And 32 countries and Taiwan have been declared free of highly enriched uranium. So we're really driving down at this point, when you hear us talking about this dangerous material, we're down to a couple dozen countries, and almost all of those countries are using this material in some practical way. Now that doesn't mean that they need to forever use this in a practical way. We're looking at options to make those uses, to give alternatives to those uses, which I can talk about in a minute. But we're also no longer talking about as many countries that just have inventories of materials sitting there in a warehouse because either they think they need it for some prestige or because they don't feel like they've been given the, a good enough deal to get rid of it yet. So I would put...
You say it this way because Taiwan isn't a country?
I say it this way because
not everyone wants
not
to
everyone
consider.
agrees
Okay.
that Taiwan is a
I'll just
country
check
and the U.S. does not acknowledge as a country. So, yeah. And if you ever put countries and include Taiwan, you'll get a demarche, whether you're in the government or in the private sector. It's happened. Okay. Another tangible outcome, and this gets at this issue of practical use. More than 35 highly enriched uranium-fueled research reactors and isotope production facilities. These are mostly facilities that are, on the research reactors, they're doing a variety of things from pure science to producing the kinds of isotopes that are used in nuclear medicine. And isotope production facilities, more than 35 have shut down completely or converted to using low-enriched uranium.
That's worldwide, I take it?
Worldwide, that's in 18 countries.
And that's just during the summit period. It's
Yeah, exactly.
It's over 100 since we got started.
That's right, this was just a result of the summits. And the most recent of these actually, since the summit, was the announcement of Curium, one of the large medical isotope producers, just announced in January that they fully converted their process. And again, we can get into this in the Q&A, but highly enriched uranium is used in two different ways. It's the material that actually goes into a reactor to get irradiated to produce the medical isotope itself. It also could be the fuel of the reactor that's doing the work. And so you actually have to work on converting both sides of that process. You had a question?
Yeah, I mean, to what extent is the U.S. a role model here? Like, if other countries, they're asking other countries to shut these facilities down, are we also shutting ours down?
Yeah, the U.S. is committed to shutting all of its facilities down, all of its civilian HEU facilities. We're down to 3 in the United States that that we don't have the fuel yet to be able to continue to operate the reactor using low-enriched uranium. One of them happens to be the MIT reactor, so here in Cambridge. But there's a very active, hundreds of millions of dollars international research project going on to develop and qualify the fuels to convert those last few reactors. Anytime you introduce, this goes back to safety, right? Anytime you're going to introduce a new fuel into a reactor, it takes a lot to prove that that's going to be safe. And so there's two things. One, does the new fuel provide the same functionality so that you can have the mission of the facility? 2, is it going to be safe? And that first question on functionality, that's one where you could argue, because there certainly have been cases where a reactor operator will say, a reactor operator's favorite thing in the world is a neutron. So if you tell them that they're going to get one fewer neutron out of this new fuel type, they will say, no, it doesn't have the same functionality. And so you have to actually work with the operators to say, what functionality do you actually need to do the mission that you have? And then can this fuel do that? And that's not always an easy conversation. Did you also have something you wanted to ask? So, a hand going, no? Okay. All right. Tangible outcomes. This is one sentence that encompasses a lot. The amended CPGNM entered into force after a ratification push of the summits. What that stands for is the Convention on Physical Protection of Nuclear Materials. This was an old convention, international treaty, that only covered the security of material in international transport. So if you were transporting material from one country to another, then anybody who had joined this treaty had certain security requirements. In 2005, they amended it to say it's not just international transport, it's domestic, internal transport from one facility to another. Oh, and also it's any material at any location, within a facility. That happened in 2005, and it just petered along. And it's all well and good to amend a treaty, but if nobody actually adopts the amendment, then it doesn't really make any change. So this is the major, it has now entered into force, it did in 2016. This is the major international legal foundation for nuclear security requirements. And it still is at very general levels, but it is the basis on which we can engage internationally. There have been more than 50 quote-unquote centers of excellence within the International Atomic Energy Agency's network. These are centers in lots of countries that are focusing on internal training, regional training, to make sure that anybody who, it depends on the scope of the Center of Excellence, but this is basically a way to continue the training and education on nuclear security for people who are involved in the nuclear enterprise. And then detection technologies that Matt doesn't think are important, deployed at more than 300 international border crossings. So these, I would argue they are important, but one of the reasons that they're important is because it's, one of the arguments is, oh, if you have a detector at a border, all it's going to do is force the person to go around. Well, great. Well, if you've blocked off a whole lot of places, then now you're not looking at all those places. You can just look for the places where they might be going around. So I actually think this is an important part of the network. I'm going to skip it. The point is that there were a whole lot of things that came out of the summits that have to do with ongoing cooperation on nuclear transport, on certified training of nuclear security professionals, on terrorism prevention and response. So these are areas where countries are continuing to work after the summits, and that have been opened up to all countries because there are now ways to join all of these initiatives. And the last thing I wanted to point out from the summits was that on that sustainability point, these are the international institutions and organizations that maintain the importance. So if you guys are doing stories and you're thinking about what is the law enforcement issue related to a nuclear issue, it's Interpol. If you think about big, kind of global cooperation, United Nations, the technical expertise on nuclear security, the International Atomic Energy Agency. Those are the places that you might see reference, but also the places that you should go because they have authorities and responsibilities. And focusing on the IAEA, they only created the nuclear security mission in October of 2001. Interesting month and date, right? So it's funded, it's still to this day funded with almost all voluntary contributions. They run an incident and emergency center, kind of an international version of what you'll see this afternoon. And they run the incident trafficking database, which is only populated voluntarily through countries, and not all countries share their information, but it's an international sharing of nuclear trafficking events. So the IAEA, a lot of people would look and say, well, why isn't the IAEA governing all of this? Well, this is why. They're new, they don't have funding, and they don't have the authority to actually exert anything over member states. They are advisory and resource-based. And I wish they were stronger. It's not for lack of, from their perspective, it's what the world has decided they should have the authority to do. But I'll tell you, if there's a major nuclear terrorism event, the first thing that a lot of people, public, journalists, leaders, are all going to do is they're going to look and say, IAEA, what were you doing to prevent this? And the answer is they were doing the best they could, but the states have not actually given them a lot of authority. So I'll stop there. I do want to, maybe say for going forward in the Q&A, some things that we could talk about is kind of what are we looking in the future on nuclear security challenges, cyber, unmanned aerial vehicles, the idea of insiders. There are a lot of places that this is not about, I can say, like, you take away one thing, is that nuclear security is not how many guards, where are the gates, how many guns do they have. That's not nuclear security. Nuclear security, it's not all of it, it's part of it. But nuclear security should be all about how do we secure, protect, eliminate, and reduce material. Because as Matt said, the terrorists are not likely to ever produce their own material. So if we can stop the material, we can stop the terrorism.